Welcome to the Underground, the Steel City Underground, the black and gold standard for Pittsburgh Steelers coverage. Now, here's your host, Joe Kuzma.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Steel City Underground podcast. My name is Joe Kuzma, and today I'm not joined by any of my brothers from another mother. In fact, I have a repeat guest, who was here around the time of the inception of the Steel City Underground podcast, probably one of my first guests, actually. And his name is Scott Perry, an NFL historian, and he's also an author of the book, The NFL Since 1970, which is the ultimate visual and historical reference. And Scott is here to discuss the history of the best and worst franchises since the NFL-AFL Merger. There's been a lot that's happened since 2016, Scott. So first of all, let me say welcome back, and how are you doing?
Hey, it's great to be back here, and I'm really glad to hear that you've grown exponentially in promoting the Steelers and football fandom in general.
Yeah, you know what? I got to look and see wow, it was just so long. August 1st, 2016. So quite a bit has happened since then. We've had some guys that have gone crazy, throwing furniture out of, apartment buildings and things of that nature. And in fact, just a little bit of background on yourself, Scott, for our listeners out there. Scott is a Denver Broncos fan, and there's been quite a bit that's happened with your franchise as well.
Since 16, yeah, nothing good, and I don't want to get into that. That's a Bronco podcast, but needless to say, I'm happy to be on with the Steeler fans. I am not one of them, but I just need to honor them as being the winningest organization in pro football since kickoff 1970, when the Steelers, Browns, and Colts joined the AFL, become the AFC. So,
well, you let the cat out of the bag a little bit there, but we'll talk a little bit about that, because I think that surprises some folks. A lot of people are used to praising the New England Patriots as a dynasty, and they tend to forget their early history is not so great. And I guess the Steelers kind of luck out as being a dynasty at the beginning of right around the turn of this merger, winning 4 Super Bowls in the 70s, always being a contender. But I think the reason I say it surprises folks is back when we met up in 2016, the Steelers were still, pretty much, they had 2 down seasons, 2012 and 2013, where they finished 8-8. But, 2015, 2016 season that ends up following that, and the 2 seasons that follow since we talked were both playoff seasons. They didn't end necessarily. Well, you had an AFC Championship loss to those darn Patriots by the Steelers, and then, of course, they had lost the divisional game after being 13-3 and having a bye. The Jacksonville Jaguars that year just had their number more than once, and then they've bowed out of being in the playoffs twice with a team in 2018 many felt was a Super Bowl contender. Of course, last year, we always think we're entitled to being a Super Bowl contender, Scott, but an 8-8 season without Ben Roethlisberger. So, I don't know, kind of take us through a little bit. You don't necessarily have to go just from 2016 on through to here, but kind of comparing what the Steelers have been able to do over this period of time, maybe, and some of their other contemporaries that are in the running, including your Broncos.
Okay. Well, first of all, I want to again thank you, Joe. You're flying by the seat of your pants here. It encourages me. I want to get more involved with podcasting and doing some people stuff. But that said, I want to just, before I forget, throw out my email, scott@NFL-since-1970.com, because I want to hear from a bunch of Steeler fans. I want to put together a Zoom meeting with all you guys. And I'm not doing my visual of the pages, which I have done in the past, is a podcast called Foam Finger Nation out of Austin. And I've been on there 3 times, and I've been able to do a little video with him when he's hosting it. But I want to get together with some Steeler fans and just show the awesome pages of the book, which is also, if you email me, make them out of the basement. So that's how you get a copy of it. But so that said, real quick, the book is called NFL Since 1970 because in 1979, living in Rochester, New York, I discovered Ed and Steve Sable's work on Inside the NFL, highlighting every game's highlights every week to heart-pounding, slow-motion instant replay. And if it wasn't for that, I'm pretty sure I would be an indifferent fan today. I was a a Mets fan growing up. Baseball couldn't hold my interest, but those guys doing what they did for showing highlights weekly with some great footage, I went from 0 to 60 being a fanatic fan. Had to make a decision. Am I going to be a Buffalo Bills fan being an hour away from there, or having previously been a Denver resident, am I going to love the team that I used to be a resident of? And I picked the Broncos, and the rest is history. Real quick, I experienced 5 years from 81 to 85 of nothing out of the Broncos. They weren't a bad team. They got Elway in that time, but 0 playoff wins after the 85 season. We win 11, miss the playoffs, and that's it. I decided to sit down in January 86, and I manually, with no computer back then, I just got out of high school. I'm going to community college here in Denver, and I added up all 28 franchises, 15 seasons since kickoff 1970. And out of 28 teams, Denver had only a quarter of those teams better in regular season winning percentage. So I felt better, and it's evolved into this book. And so we are now at season 50. 70 till today is 50 seasons. With 4 seasons to go, my Broncos were in second place, 17 behind Pittsburgh, and I was confident we were going to overcome that franchise and be the winningest team at the 50th anniversary.
Well, let me interject right there. So the last time we talked, they were second to Pittsburgh. That is what you're saying, right? And then that was right when the Broncos had just won the Super Bowl in 2015. That was Peyton Manning's swan song.
Right, and in 16 they were 9-7, missed the playoffs, and then they hired Vance Joseph, and that was it. So they start, just real quick. The Broncos started the 50 years with 3 losing seasons, and they've ended them with 3 losing seasons. We'll talk more about that, but in that time frame, we could not. You mentioned the Steelers' seasons recently, and I did not expect them to fare that well. I did. They just kept. All of a sudden, they had a bad start one year, and all of a sudden, they just rolled through the rest of the season. And I was just pulling my hair out. There's no way we're going to catch you guys, and Denver ended up falling behind New England in the time period. So Denver's now 4th to Pittsburgh's 5th, and they've got a pretty. Real quick, this is stuff that comes to my head. Starting this last season, if Dallas had gone 16-0 and Pittsburgh had gone 0-16, Pittsburgh still would have won this title by 4 games. But they both won 8, so they had a decent lead over the Cowboys going into this 51st season we're heading into.
Yeah, and I'm glad you bring that up because I don't know that there's a lot of animosity. I've mentioned this before when I had you on before. In fact, I have several other friends who are Broncos fans. I don't think there's animosity really between Steelers and Broncos. Yeah, there's some games where we wish it would have went one way or the other between both franchises, particularly the one I think that sticks in everyone's craw most recently is the Tim Tebow game. However, aside from that, when we hear we're better than the Dallas Cowboys, quote-unquote, America's team, or throw out anybody else, like let's say the Cleveland Browns, for example, probably one of the biggest smack talkers between those two franchises, the Steelers fans definitely, we feel a little encouraged to hear things of that nature, you know. So basically what Scott says is, if Dallas had a perfect season last year and the Steelers went 0-16, the Cowboys still would have been behind. So I guess that's a testament to the Steelers organization and, of course, the stability. There are 3 coaches over the entire span, and those 3 coaches, one should have been one is technically going into the Hall of Fame. No ceremonies this year, unfortunately, due to the COVID-19 stuff that's going on with Bill Cowher. Chuck Noll already in the Hall of Fame, and I know some people they may grit their teeth at this, but Mike Tomlin will eventually, I think, get his due there as well, especially if he wins another Super Bowl. I mean, it's a lock. So it's kind of interesting to see over a period of time because had we been talking about prior to the AFL-NFL merger, the Steelers probably aren't in this. They're probably in the conversation, the running for the worst team, let alone the best.
Well, I give talks to senior communities. I had 3 talks booked in Tucson when this started. I had to cancel that, but I've been talking in Denver now for 6 years, informing Bronco fans. But the book has made me an expert of all 32 franchises, and it's just crazy to think about how it's progressed over all these seasons. And I talk about Pittsburgh from 33 to 69. not being one of the worst football teams, being one of the worst sports teams in America. And I had my facts wrong. I thought that was a coin flip that determined that, 1-13 was the record of the Bears and the Steelers in 1969. And somehow, Pittsburgh ended up with the first pick. They picked Terry Bradshaw. Within a decade, they have 4 trophies. 100-year-old franchise in Chicago. And I always ask Bear fans, who's your franchise quarterback? And I get crickets. So it's a frustrating year, that 69 season that made a big difference for that Steeler organization.
Well, not only that, but Mean Joe Green had definitely transformed the franchise, as well as Chuck Noll. So I can't put it all on. We call him the real TB12 here, Terry Bradshaw, that is, rather than Tom Brady. But yeah, there's a couple of things that are going on there. That's a good point about the Bears. I never really thought about that. I mean, when you think of the Bears, I think of guys like Walter Payton, you know what I mean? I don't think of like Jim McMahon or then they go to the Super Bowl with Rex Grossman, most recently. And, it's kind of unfortunate for such a storied franchise to have such an up and down. And I guess one of the reasons to have you on wasn't necessarily to brag and beat my chest or anything and say for everyone else to say, hey, the Steelers are really great. It's just to know just how good you have it sometimes, because what was there? There was one single playoff appearance leading up to the arrival of Chuck Noll. It's as bad as actually the flip side of this, Scott, would probably be if we compared to the Pirates, the way they've been since maybe, the 90s. They're a team that people in the city have a little bit of animosity towards ownership and leadership there, just because, one, they're a little tight with their dollar, and because they're tight with their dollar, they don't necessarily keep the best talent. And I think some of that spills over sometimes with the Steelers as to who they pay or who they do not pay, without realizing the way baseball and football are structured differently. In that sense, it's very difficult, maybe even since this is something I should throw out to you too. You probably don't have the answer off the top of your head, but even the salary cap and free agency era, which teams have been, the rock solid teams versus which teams haven't, because it's very difficult to keep a winning consistency over such a long period of time. Yet the Steelers have done it. But aside from, we've already discussed. You mentioned the Cowboys briefly. We've been talking Steelers a little bit, Broncos a little bit. Who are some other teams that kind of show up as popping off the page here, in maybe your top 5 or 10 franchises since the merger?
Okay, so you're asking about what are the top 5 in winning percentage? That's what my book is all. You asked about salary, and it's interesting that I have no players mentioned in my book. My goal was to see my Broncos be the New York Yankees of professional. So when I go on the radio and people ask about any future, I have nothing to say other than Broncos win, Raiders lose. That's my only take on anything in the future. It's all about the historic aspect of it.
We're okay with that too. They're still crying about the immaculate reception, so there's no love lost there either.
Yeah, Raider fans are I can't bring that up. But anyway, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. What was
Oh,
that?
yeah. No. When I was mentioning the salary, I wasn't mentioning specifically players, but I was kind of like free agency. When the free agency period actually began in the NFL, and you had like the salary cap, it'd be interesting to see some win percentages from then too. But I know that's not your primary focus here. But I was discussing maybe some of the other teams as far as win percentages. You mentioned that the Steelers are among the top. Broncos are probably still somewhere among the top, and then the Cowboys, I assume you had just said they were coming into second heading into last season. Are they still in second place there?
The history of number 1 here real quick. It's mixed between the Raiders for a couple of years. So at 1970 till today, my book is visual. It's just a visual of the helmets. I use the helmets worn each season as the standings. Below that's a playoff grid. That's on the left side. Side of the book is the compilation. I divide the league in half, winners and losers. Occasionally, like Pittsburgh and Minnesota, both one compilation are on the losing side but have a winning record. So Pittsburgh's never had a losing record of anything, but they did manage to get on the losing side because there were so many winning teams in whatever compilation page. I can't think about which page that is right now, but that's the gist of it. So when you flip the page on the far right, I list the helmets as they first appear in the book, and they don't change over the 50 seasons. and you watch in an animated fashion how these teams perform every season of the 50. So I bring that up because in the beginning it's jostling of the Vikings, Dolphins, Cowboys, Raiders. But in 1994, in his second year, Pittsburgh favorite kind of Dan Marino goes to Palo Alto, plays the 49ers, and loses in his second year in 84. That, after a couple of brief years of Miami being number one from 70 to whatever year you're looking at, now in 1984, 70 to 84, the Dolphins are the first team. Okay, Joe, the question is, which year do you think the Dolphins, who started in 84, relinquished their number one spot in every game played since 1970 in the regular season only? So in 84, they became the number one team in winning percentage. What year would you guess that they stopped having that title?
Well, I was trying to cheat and see when Dan Marino retired. Was that like around 93 or so? I guess I'll find out here in a second. I was trying to pull up some of the Dolphins history here. No, Marino was still... No, what am I thinking? 93. Oh, 90... Wow. I mean, they had Don Shula. They had Jimmy Johnson. It's got to be somewhere around the turn of the century if I had to get... If I'm looking at this trying to cheat, and I can't really guess. But they still had an awful lot of success up until, well, Tony Sperano. So maybe this is actually a lot sooner than I thought. Maybe around like 2008 or 2009?
Wow, you nailed it, which is really impressive. If you go through my book and you look at all the seasons, they have a lot of mediocre. I call it, when I give my talks to seniors, I hold up all the helmets in a die cut form, and I go through worst to first. And I say, here's the bookend team. The Miami Dolphins, 17-0, best team in the history of maybe pro sports, going undefeated. That's debatable, I know that. But maybe not so debatable is they're the worst team in one season, where they had a 16-game season and they finished 15 games out behind the undefeated New England Patriots. So they've had been up and down. But, Shula retired in 95. So if you go to the 1995 page, that page shows you every Shula game as a Dolphin head coach. And he was 257 wins and 133 losses. Now, that's a lot of inertia he built up. So for him to retire in 95 and then them have not been in the Super Bowl since 85, that's pretty good. But the whole point of this is that at the end of the last game of the 2009 season, Pittsburgh goes to Miami and beats them 30-24. And the result of that game is that from kickoff 1970 until that point in time, they both had 372 wins, 242 losses, and 2 ties. So they tied, and I had to go for the one time 4 decimal places to determine who the number one team was from 70 to 2009. And Miami came to Denver in 71 and tied the Broncos in the opening day, which is a big game in Bronco history because Lou Saban went for the tie at the end of the game and kicked a field goal. But because that game in 71 didn't count it as it did in 72 as a half a win, I had to back that game out at the compilation, and I gave them a 506, a 6 winning percentage to Pittsburgh's 6055 winning percentage. So I bring that up because that end of that early in the 2010 season, Pittsburgh took over the winningest franchise title of every game played since 70, and they've been running away with it pretty much ever since.
So when was that date again? Which game was that?
That they took it over?
Yeah.
I looked it up, and it was probably within the first 4 weeks of the 2010 season.
Wow, 2010, which the Steelers had actually that was the Super Bowl year they had lost. Oh, let me see. I'm going over to, okay. So it was a 23-22 victory by the Steelers 2010 season. That was the year they had lost to the Green Bay Packers in the Super Bowl. That's a pretty interesting game. And just to bring that up, October 24th, 2010, Wow, this is sometimes we go back in a time machine here and bring up some stuff, but we're looking at a Jeff Reed 18-yard field goal, which gave the Steelers the advantage there, and that's going back. Jeff Reed's been on the show before here too, Scott, and he's I want to call him a colorful character, but he really is he's a great guy. He'd probably give you the shirt off his back. He got a rap for being a young knucklehead back when he was a younger football player, and those type of things tend to stick with you as far as reputation. But anyways, yeah, we're talking about Hines Ward, Mike Wallace, 53-yard pass from Ben Roethlisberger. I was just kind of curious because there's the games where there's a pretty infamous game where the Steelers played the Dolphins in Miami, and it was like an absolute mud pit. In fact, Reebok had actually came out and made some jerseys that were an off-color white, and they called them storm jerseys. I remember Ben Roethlisberger's jersey looking like that, but I think it was a little bit earlier in his career, and I believe it was a primetime game, and somebody's going to scold me for not knowing this off the top of my head. Sorry, it all blends together sometimes, but it's a pretty cool visual there. I was hoping that it would be the same one, but it actually wasn't, however. I guess Mike Tomlin gets the credit for winning that game, and that was Tony Sperano. And I happen to have another friend of mine who's been a Dolphins fan all his life, and man, he has not been a happy guy for the last decade or decade and a half. And it started with Sperano, so that's kind of like how I was able to just make a lucky guess and throw a dart there, because it seems like that's been the downward spiral for the Dolphins. So we're just out of curiosity, for a team that was basically the tops for until the last 10 years or so, where do they kind of stand now? Are they in the middle of the pack still based on their previous winning history, or have they kind of just fallen off completely?
That's why I love this project, because it shows me all the franchises. So when you break it up in half, first part is 14 on the winning side, 14 on the losing side. Now there's 16 and 16. Some teams never get out of the bottom half of the losing side. Some never get out of the top half of the losing side. Some never get out of the Bears never get out of the bottom of the winning side. Some teams never get in the top 10. So the Dolphins, who from 84 to 09 were number one, they're now at their lowest point of number 5. So it's a big deal. I mean, I say in my book that they had an 87-game lead over the Patriots going into this century, and now they're trailing by 6 behind the Patriots.
Wow. Well, they may get a chance to catch up now. We'll have to see. We'll see if Cam Newton or Jason Stidham's the starter there in New England, and we'll see if the Dolphins, Tua Tagovailoa, man. We'll have to see if things are going to change and kind of turn that ship right around. And it's just really interesting because, yeah, Miami and for a spell there too, Buffalo, those were the teams that were ruling the AFC East, and now it's just been New England, and it's like they're a shoo-in to make the playoffs every year because everybody was laying down for them. And, of course, I don't want to downplay Buffalo. Buffalo's been definitely turned their team around over the last 3 seasons as well, but I kind of want to I want to poke some fun at a franchise if I can. I don't know if I can, but there's a particular team in the NFL, and they are within the same division of the Steelers. I'd mentioned them earlier, where all I hear about is NFL championships and whatever the old AAFC and everything else. And, they had Jim Brown, one of the greatest running backs of all time. And I continue to hear about how Steelers fans are like, the old light bulb, or we watch stuff on the History Channel. But I swear Browns fans live in this fantasy world where their team has been successful for this long period of time. But that's not been the case. Obviously, they have not even appeared in a Super Bowl. So I'm kind of curious where the Cleveland Browns stand since the AFL-NFL merger, according to your statistics. Well,
we're really going to be kicking a dog when it's down here, and I'm
That's okay. There's no better dog.
I'm a Browns fan than a Steelers fan, so it kind of hurts me to say this, but here's some rundown. When they ceased to exist in 1995, from kickoff 1970 till that point in time, Do you think they were above or below 500 in regular season?
I do believe they would have been above 500. I don't think that they were that bad. And in fact, the 80s, they definitely had the advantage on the Steelers more than one time.
That's an educated guess. They were actually one game. If they had won one more game, they would have been over 500 based on their ties. That they would have made a difference. So if my book ranks every team 1 to 32, how many teams do you think now are holding them off from holding a seller? So they were they were number 10 out of 20, 28 or 30 back in 95. And now how many teams are below them from kickoff 70 until today? We have 3 seasons missing in their history, unfortunately.
Yeah, if I had to go by the trajectory that the Dolphins were going, which was kind of like my train of thought here, and I don't mean to just crap. In fact, my wife's a Browns fan, if you weren't aware, Scott. In fact, half my family is. Growing up, I grew up in Northeast Ohio, about an hour between Cleveland and Pittsburgh, actually. So there's a lot of 50-50 there between Steelers and Browns fans. So I always like to have the ammo to go after them with. So I was thinking about that trajectory with the Dolphins and how they fell off with 2009, and I'm like, man, Cleveland is, not been good for a very, very long time, especially since they've returned. One playoff appearance maybe since they've been back in the league? So you're asking me how close to the bottom they are. How many teams would be behind them out of 32 at this point? Man, really putting me on the spot. If you're going with a quarter of the teams, that would be 8. I would say there has to be maybe, they can't be like the absolute worst. But this is all by percentage, correct? So, I mean, like the Baltimore Ravens are actually more than likely ahead of them, if I had to guess.
The Ravens have always been in the top 10 since about 2006 or something like that.
Okay, that's fascinating. I'm really trying to give this some real thought, and I'm giving it just a little bit of time to the season for the listeners too, who are still hanging on here. I'm going to guess that the Bengals are behind them. The Jets very well could be behind them too. I'm trying to think who else. I mean, the Falcons have been miserable for some time, but they haven't been, I don't know, as miserable from that period of time. I'm trying to think who else could be there. Obviously, let me see. Dolphins are still going to be ahead of them based on their previous history. I'm going to go with 6. 6 teams from the bottom.
Let's count down from the 20th down to the 32nd real quick. I haven't really done this before. It's kind of an interesting way to go. So number 20 is the Titans. 21st is the Chargers. 22nd, and coming up is my Saints. I'm a big Saints fan. I'm a big Bills fan too. They're 23rd. There's the Falcons at 24. The Bengals are way up at 25th. They had a good stretch. The cellar. They were never in the cellar, but.
Yeah, that's true. Even though they haven't won any playoff games, I guess they still had some division titles and some playoff appearances. That would probably balance it out.
12 under 500 last year was a big bump for them. 26th team is the Texans. 27th from kickoff 95 till today. The Jaguars are the 27th. My trivia question of who's won the least amount of division championships since the merger. Can you guess that is the answer for number 28? What would your guess be?
Least amount of division championships. Oh, let me see.
Like in 82, so there's 49 possible division titles.
Okay, yeah, that's true too. I'm trying to think. It would have to be a team that doesn't have a whole lot of. I'm going to go with the Detroit Lions.
You know what? They have one more than this team does.
Oh, man.
He's a victim of the division we were just contemplating a second ago.
Okay. Arizona Cardinals.
No, it's my New York Jets. I have pictures of me growing up. So the Dolphins in the 70s and 80s, the Bills in the 90s, and then the Patriot dynasty, keeping them they have 2 division championships of 49 possible.
Wow.
Pretty pathetic.
So what number were they at now? I lost count. Were they 28th?
28 out of 32.
Okay.
29 is the Cardinals. And then the next 2 teams are the ones that have put their cities through winless seasons. Detroit at 30, Cleveland at 31, and only the Buccaneers have held the last place of most of the 50 seasons. Well, they started in 76, so
Wow. You know what? I'd almost had guessed them. The Jets were still on my brain, but for some reason I was thinking, I'm like, you think of Broadway Joe and stuff like that. You think I was thinking maybe some earlier success, but I guess not. But wow. So only one team since the Browns have returned is technically worse than what they are. That's kind of mind-blowing. In a way it isn't, though. I guess when you talk about, bad, we were just mentioning it with the early Steelers teams up until Chuck Noll's arrival and saying, they were probably one of the worst teams in sports. I guess you could probably say that about the Cleveland Browns, too. Hugh Jackson going 1-15 and winless seasons and actually it was 1-31. I think they say January 31st is Hugh Jackson Day up in Cleveland, so there's something of that nature. But wow, that's just kind of surprising. It was actually surprising. You bring up a good point too, that the Bengals were where they were and that the Ravens have been on the winning half since that whole move. It's just that's such a pivot point in professional football when the Cleveland Browns become the Baltimore Ravens and all the things that have spun off of that, including, if anyone's ever watched I'm sure you have, being a fan of like the NFL film stuff, the Football Life, the Cleveland 1995, was it? Where, Bill Belichick and all the guys he had on his coaching tree there with the Cleveland Browns in their last season in Cleveland, and he leaves and ends up, shacking back up with Bill Parcells and everything, and ends up taking over the reins with the New England Patriots, and the rest is history. And it just there's a lot of speculation and what ifs in there whenever I speak to Browns fans or they talk about some of that history, and it is unfortunate too because I just don't understand. It seemed like they were given a pretty good foothold when they returned to the league as far as an expansion franchise. The Houston Texans, obviously, as well. But I know some of that, somewhere in there, it was like, okay, the Jaguars and Panthers came in. They were both in the conference championships in their second year. And they were like, well, this competitive balance and the way we did this, maybe we don't do it the same way when we invite more teams in. But the reason they did it with those teams is because, as you said, the Buccaneers have been pretty much in the basement ever since. So it's kind of an interesting kind of paradigm there and compare and contrast. So I know we're getting a little long in the tooth here. You may have a few more interesting facts you want to throw out there for the listeners. So I'll kind of leave the floor to you, Scott.
Right. Well, since you brought the Browns up, just making this book is so much fun. It's a great coffee table book to just flip through, and you mentioned the Ravens, and exactly the reason why there are helmets representing the teams is because I was a purist back and I discovered that HBO TV show, and I wanted the league to always stay that way. So when teams move, I get really frustrated to have to change nicknames, not necessarily, but cities. That's why it's just a helmet. If a team changed the face mask the next year, my example is the gray face mask Bengals in 79 last place, but said Bengals, black face mask in 80 last place, changed to the stripes. And in the book, there's 5 teams that changed their helmet and go to the Super Bowl that year. So I bring that up, but I want to the Browns real quick. So my book at the end of it, I break it down by each decade as a time period. So now there's 5 complete decades. So I just did this last decade. So in early 2013, the Browns lost their 36th game of the decade. So kickoff 2010 till the end of this season last year. The Browns' 36th loss came early in 2013. Now, going into week 1, if New England loses, that'll be their 36th game since kickoff 2010.
Wow.
And it gets better. So I also broke it down by the century because 2000 to present is kind of something I like to keep track of too. So 2008, from kickoff 2000 to 2008, sometime in that season, the Browns lost their 86th game of this century. So if the Patriots lose opening day, they'll have lost their 86th game of this century. So the comparison between those two teams is just
yeah, it's night and day, very much so, black and white. But I said we were kind of up against it, but I do want to mention though, I had the previous copy of this book, and it's something that as you flip through, it is a visual guide. little, light on the reading, but a lot of hardcore statistics there for you stat heads. So it's something that's very interesting. And Scott has it over on the website. We'll include that in the show notes so you could find it. But just so you know, it's NFL-since-1970.com. And you can find more information about Scott in the book and how to purchase it and things of that nature as well. You could also reach Scott. He had mentioned earlier a Zoom project. So you could find his email at scott@NFL-since-1970.com. That's also in the footer at the bottom of his website. And I guess, you know what, that kind of puts a bow on it. And hopefully we don't take 4 or 5 years to get back together again, Scott, because this is kind of a fun thing to revisit every now and then.
There's stuff I'm chomping at the bit to mention here, so I'll leave it up to you as to when that comes out, but let's do that soon.
Yeah, absolutely. So once again, folks, that's Scott Perry with NFL-since-1970.com and his book that's titled The NFL Since 1970, about as interesting or it's about as obvious as you can be, I guess. I'm being Captain Obvious. So, Scott, thanks once again for joining us today.
Thanks again. It's been fun.
Yeah, absolutely. It's usually Brian's word when he's on here, so I had to throw it in there right here at the tail end. So, listeners, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And we'll be coming back to you with either some more NFL-type stuff or Steelers stuff as news or any other information permits here. And we'll be sure to probably get back on more of a regular schedule here as myself and Brian wrap up our vacations as well. So, it's the summer months. We've been cooped up, as I'm sure you have, Scott. So enjoy the nice weather while you can. And I also encourage all of our listeners out there as well to be safe, be good, and we'll catch you later.
We would like to thank you for listening and remind our listeners to follow us on social media and our website, www.steelcityunderground.com.